So you guys had really great concepts and ideas for your websites. Part of what you're going to get from the official project management presentation is that when you're developing websites, it's a really good idea to have like wireframes and mock-ups of where you want to go. I've come across this tool. We use it at some of our classes at Metro. It's called Axure, is how I pronounce. I think that's the correct pronunciation. If you hit this website /.edu, there's a free downloadable tool, cloud-based application. You can actually jump on. I'll get some video learning materials out there to teach you guys how to use it. One of the things I think I would like, well, one of the things we want to see you do between now and the next time we meet is to come up with a rough wireframe of what your website's going to look like, and also a sitemap. So the tool is fairly easy to use. Again, I'll get some learning materials out in Slack to get you guys started on this. But if you want to make note, we'll publish the URL out in Slack as well. Basically, the way this works is you go to the site, you can do a free download, and you actually get an unlimited, unrestricted, full access version of this product. You just simply need to fill out your registration information, use your student email address. I think it's I guess that's a good question. They normally want .edu domains, but let me know if you guys run into any issue with this. So make sure you use your school address. They may ask you for a student ID just in case the, is it ops.org if I'm not mistaken? So if that gets kicked back, you might want to take a picture of your photo ID, upload that, and then they'll send you a licensing key so that you have unrestricted access to the software. So that's something, again, we'll post in Slack, give you some directions on how to use it. A really easy tool to use. You can actually publish your wireframes and mock-ups of your potential websites in a cloud location. So we'll go over that next week. Again, more details to follow on the project management piece. So I'm looking, I just don't want to, Shauna's going to be here hopefully shortly. So I don't want to steal too much of her thunder. We're going to shift gears, and what we normally were going to cover at about 1 o'clock. I'm going to jump into the HTML piece for now, just to give you guys a, I know we've got students at varied backgrounds, so I'm going to give you like a condensed lecture of what we might talk about for students beginning this concept. So just by show of hands, how many of you guys have had experience with HTML? I'm just kind of curious, so it'll let me know how fast I need to go or how slow. Okay, and everyone else has maybe never seen or used the language before? Is that a fair statement? Okay. So I kind of expected such, so I'm going to kind of start from the beginning and try not to bore everyone else, so you guys bear with me if you've seen some of this before. But for those of you that have maybe never had exposure to what HTML is and what CSS is, this is a mini crash course, and we're going to follow up and give you guys a whole bunch of learning resources that hopefully will make you successful for this class or this project. So some of the things I want to talk about, I think it's important before we just jump in and have you guys start coding pages, maybe just to have a high-level understanding of what HTML is and what CSS does and how they come together to form web presentations. So these are some of the things we're going to cover, just maybe giving you a brief background on what the web is and how it's differentiated from the internet, some basic concepts of web standards, universal design, what it means to make accessible web pages. We're going to talk about browsers and how they work together with web server communication. And then we're just going to differentiate between HTML, CSS, so you guys know the basics of that. And hopefully today let you guys walk away with some basic boilerplate starter documents so that you can get started if this is something you've never done before. So one of the questions I want to ask is, can you guys differentiate, or do you think there's a differentiation between the internet and the World Wide Web? How might you guys define the internet? Anybody? So what does the internet mean to you, like your simple definition?
It's the network that's just in the air.
Yep. So it's simply a network of computers that spans the globe is what the internet is. And then the next point, the World Wide Web, is really a subset of the internet. So the web, as we know it, is pretty much a collective use of web browsers that run on top of the internet. So I just wanted to make sure you guys understand that concept. It's really important. And then specifically, what we're going to do, or what you guys are tasked to do, is to come up with web presentations that run in web browsers. And we're going to focus our attention on modern web browsers. So Google Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Internet Explorer, Edge are the ones we're going to focus your design attentions on. So for those of you that have done some web design, are any of you familiar with this organization, W3C? Okay. Can any of you share your understanding of what they do and what's the importance of this organization? So tell me your name again. Yeah, you. You was okay. I won't put you on the spot. So W3C, it's the World Wide Web Consortium, and this organization is a global group of individuals that come together to form web standards. So anyone that is designing web pages, they look to this organization as a guiding rule, they set the standards for what we do in web design and development. So when it comes to HTML, all the rules that govern how web pages are created we as developers or designers look at this organization for guidance. And this website, it's a site that basically has all of the current standards for what HTML is and what we should be following as developers or designers. So as you guys are creating your projects, one of the things we're strongly recommending is that you want to create compliant or standard HTML pages. So there's a thing called rough or loose code or hacked code. We want to make sure that we're creating pages that are meeting current web standards and that are supported by current web browsers. So we'll visit this site here in just a moment. And then additionally, what goes along with W3C compliance is that we want to make sure our sites are accessible to the masses. So not only to individuals that have their normal faculties, but individuals that maybe have a disability. We want to make sure our sites are accessible to the masses. So if it's someone that has a visual impairment, we want to make sure we're being considerate. So if we're doing standard web design, in general, most of the things we're going to consider or include on our web pages should meet these basic standards. So I won't really dive too deep into these, but as you guys get time, I would encourage you to go back. We'll post this presentation. You can dive a little bit deeper as to what's considered HTML or W3C compliant and accessibility standards that are met by the federal government. So the ADA and Section 508, basically, these are two standards, substandards of web design. And it's simply saying that when you create a website, you want to make sure that there's no audience that's left out. If it's someone that has a visual impairment, you want to make sure that your site has all the required minimum components so that they can access it. So if someone that has a visual impairment needs a screen reader, if you're coding your site compliant to these standards, they shouldn't have a problem using it with some of their accessibility tools. Okay, and then another subcomponent of that, again, is if we're meeting these basic standards, as you guys, I think I heard one team mention that you guys wanted to do a mobile-first web design. So the goal is that whatever you create across your teams, you want to make sure that the user should not have to guess or have a specific tool to access your website. So again, if we're focusing on modern web design, those websites that support modern web browsers, it should kind of come second nature, but there's some literature here that you can read that goes a little bit deeper. And again, we're giving you a crash course on some of this, and we'll have individuals around that kind of help you guys go a little bit deeper as you start getting into your projects. But the main thing that we want to stress today is that make sure your sites are standards, they meet W3C standards, and they're compliant and they're forward compatible, so forward and backwards compatible. Okay, so let me just ask a couple questions here real quick. Cool. So can someone in your own words, kind of based on what I said, tell me how you would differentiate the web and the internet again? Yes.
The internet is the network of computers, and the web is how we actually access that. Network, and the web browsers are the interpreter for that.
Exactly. Yeah. So in a GUI interface, the browsers kind of help us get across the internet. You're right. And then someone want to attempt to maybe redefine universal design as I've explained it, and just a real simple definition is sufficient. Go ahead.
Any sort of disabilities to be able to access it without having to use special things?
I would say that's part of it. I guess the answer I was looking for is that universal design is basically designing for the masses. So you want to consider those individuals with or disabilities or any visual impairment, hearing impairment, et cetera. But also, you want to take the guesswork out of web presentation for the end user. So you want to make sure your sites are compatible to the masses is the goal. Okay, good answer though, thank you. Okay, so going a little bit deeper, we're not going to go too far down this path, but I think it's also important to understand the technology behind the internet and the web. So in a nutshell, when we think about our experience on the internet and when it comes to web browsers and websites, it's a real simple networking model, a client-server model. Has anyone heard of this concept before? Okay, so shaking your head, maybe share with the group your understanding of this concept.
Yeah, so like the client is accessing your website, is asking the database, or it's requesting something from the server, and the server is something that's providing that information.
Yep. So specifically, so in our case, we are end users. If we're on a computer, our client can be our desktop machines, laptops, could even be a mobile device if we have a web browser. And then simply when we're hitting a website, a server is some remote location, some machine running in a cloud that has web pages or web content or assets. And we're typing in an address bar on a browser to access those assets. And it's just a back and forth communication that allows us as a client user to access a web server with web content. So this is just kind of a visual picture of that, and it's just a constant back and forth communication between you as an end user on a client machine, and you're using your browser to help facilitate that communication. So thus the internet client server model. So that's what we're doing basically. We're creating web pages that help us interact or help end users interact in this experience. So, so just more technical lingo. We won't spend too much time on this. And then the heart of what makes up the web as we know it are markup languages, and specifically HTML. So what you guys are tasked to do this whole project is to come up with HTML pages, hypertext markup language pages that will be accessible across multiple web browsers. And again, some of you have heard of this, and for those of you that haven't, again, we're trying to give you a crash course. We'll make ourselves available to help, if this is something totally new to you. Myself, Guillermo, we have some of our students at Metro that will be here to help give you guys fill in the blanks, even though we can't really cover everything we would like you to have. You have your teachers at your disposal, and you'll have us too, and we have some more community folks that can kind of mentor your teams as needed to get you up to speed where you may have some gaps. So, any questions so far, you guys? Okay, so I'll keep moving. So specifically, when we're working with our expectation for this project is that, again, you guys are going to work with HTML5 as the new standard. Specifically, HTML 5.1 is what W3C is mandating. It's a specification for website design. Again, it's basically a set of rules that this organization has created that lets all designers, developers know that they need to follow these models or standards so that their sites can be accessible to the masses. And you've heard me talk quite a bit about modern browsers, and again, from an HTML5 perspective, there are some browsers that are considered more forward or more progressive in their support for HTML5 standards. And the ones that we normally recommend, or the ones I recommend, are Google Chrome. In my opinion, is one of the best supporting browsers of HTML5 standards. Firefox, I would say, is probably right in line with that. Safari, Internet Explorer, Edge. They don't provide they do provide support for HTML5, but some of the support they provide is kind of spotty. So my point is, when you guys are developing your sites, it's an iterative process where you're testing and coding your pages. My strong recommendation is to rely heavily on Google Chrome and Firefox for best broad support. So when you're looking at your pages, coding and testing, you want to make sure you have those browsers installed on your machines for testing purposes. Okay. Has anyone never used Chrome or Firefox? I'm hoping you guys are all familiar with those browsers. Okay. Cool. Let's see. So these next series of slides, again, I'm going to do my best to give you a crash course in this, just to give you, we'll do a little bit of coding. Well, I'll show you some code snippets, and I've got some samples that you guys can go out and access on your own. So some of this may be review for some of you. For those of you that have never seen this, I've tried to provide a good depth of resources so that you can come back on your own and work through this at your own pace. So I'm just going to hit some of the basic tags that make up an HTML document. But in a nutshell, HTML is just a series of tags and keyword phrases that make up those tags to form the structure of a web page. And basically, the notation is opening and closing braces, and then you'll have a keyword within these braces to help form the structure of an HTML document or a web page. So, for example, there's an anatomy of a web page, and this section called the DTD section of a web page is basically what tells the web browser how to render your web page. So it's a set of codes, cryptic words that communicate with the web browser that you're using that will tell it, okay, I'm a page that's developed in HTML5. I need you to render my page this way for the end user. And again, it's a standard set of rules defined by W3C. And where we are today, HTML has evolved over the years. We used to be at a standard called XHTML 1.0. We're currently using, I mentioned, HTML5. So when we create our documents, all HTML5 documents, if they're W3C compliant, need to have this basic doc type definition in the beginning when we create our pages. So this is just to kind of show you where we used to be. Much easier now to code this. And again, we'll give you some templates to kind of help you get started if you're not familiar with this. So I'm just curious, those of you that have done some HTML coding, have you created, or do you use validator tools to kind of help check your code? Are you familiar with that concept? No? Okay, so we'll introduce that to you guys too. So here's the makings of a beginning document, a real loosely structured page. So every web page in some form or fashion should have these basic components. So you'll notice the doc type, which is again telling the web browser what the web page or how to render this web page. Again, more doc type data to tell the browser that this page needs to be rendered in an English language format. The head section, again, every web page should have this. You'll have a title section and there's metadata that further define what the page is about. We won't go into great depth here today, but the structure or the main body of what every user is going to see on your web page is nested inside of this body tag. So we'll have subsequent tags that you can control the structure of your web page on, and they all nest inside of here. So basically, if it's going to show up on a web page, it's going to be residing inside of this body tag. And I've got some samples here. Again, we'll show you. So I'm kind of going through a couple of iterations of building a page out, showing you what it looks like from the very beginning stages. Questions so far, you guys? Too slow, too fast, or? Okay, so I'll keep going. So these next few slides, I'm just kind of breaking down the anatomy of the pages and telling you what their purpose is. Again, the head section describes what the page is, what you can expect to see. Really, the end user doesn't see anything that resides in this section of the document. It really just tells the browser how to render the page, or a lot of what we call metadata, stuff that's reported to search engines that help it for indexing the web page. We'll go into greater depth on that. And again, the main section that end users are going to see in their front-end interface is in the body section of the page. So you'll notice each sections have opening and closing tags. And if you notice the syntax, typically lowercase with HTML5. You can code your pages in HTML5 with uppercase, but they're non-compliant. So when we get to the point where we're going to validate and check our code, we always want to make sure that we're using lowercase syntax. Okay, questions so far, you guys? And again, this is just a simple page. Hello world is something that we normally do in a programming language. Just a real simple page testing the concept of what we're developing. And again, you'll notice the components here: doc type, head section, the page title. If you notice in this section, whatever you put here is what's actually going to show up in the browser tab or browser window. The metadata, again, is just coding or communicating with what's going on behind the scenes in the browser. And then what we actually see on the page, the hello world, is what resides inside of the body tag. Okay, questions, you guys? Okay. And so again, these next few slides, I'm going to pull what I think are the most commonly used HTML tags. This snippet is a heading tag. So as we're styling our pages, we have structured elements. And again, all HTML does is really set the structure of the web page. What I'm going to talk about later are the CSS elements, and those control the styling and layout of the page. So if we want to have a page that has multiple layer headings, you have the tag H1 through H6 that kind of helps set those standards, and then we can apply styling later on with color, background, layout, etc. And that's what our CSS will do for us. Okay, within our body tag, one of the most commonly used tags for HTML is the paragraph tag. So if we just want to have loose blocks of text, typically in some form or fashion, we're probably going to use a paragraph tag throughout our documents. A paragraph tag if we want to get a little deeper, it's considered a block level element. So with block elements in HTML, we can apply styling attributes, color, background, etc. And again, once we get into the CSS, we'll show you some of the things that we can do with that. So this slide talks about the importance of nesting your code. Hopefully you've noticed the theme as we move throughout this. Again, we've got paragraph tags, and in this case, we're using some HTML inherent styling. So the I stands for italics. So in this case, this code basically represents what you're seeing here. So the point I wanted to point out is that you have nested italic tags with your strong or the equivalent of a bold-face font. And they have to be nested in sequential order. So if you notice what we have here, this is what it would render like in a browser page if it was actually being shown there. So the point is make sure that when you're using HTML tag and sequencing, you want to make sure they're nested in like order. Okay. So one very important element of HTML5, the div element or the division tag. And this is basically another block element in HTML. Wish I had a whiteboard. Let me show you. I do. Well, I'll show you on the break. This next slide will give you a little background. But the div tag is basically, think of it as boxes on a web page. So you have your HTML block page, an unformatted page. And if you have content, typically the easiest way to manipulate it as it stands today are to put your content in placeholder block elements on a page. So if you can visualize a big empty grid, which is your web browser, and using this div tag, you can draw boxes and manipulate their placement, styling, and position with the use of this tag and other styling elements. So for example, with HTML5, the W3C organization has kind of created logical placeholder elements. So typical pages today probably have in some form or fashion a header, a navigation area, a main body area, and then the tag I just talked about are the division tags or div tags. And you can, with the use of CSS, control the position and placement of these elements. And if you can visualize inside of these div tags, you might have placeholder elements like pictures, content, etc. But this is the basic anatomy of most common web pages that we see today. Any questions, you guys? Okay. And again, this is just a simple mock-up of what that might look like. So I have a simple page here. And in this case, you got a body, basically the white background. Header section is what you'd see for the title. The navigation is what would represent those underlying links. In the main section, you'd probably have everything from here to here. And then ultimately your footer section would likely be this section of the page. So the one thing that really makes the web what is the World Wide Web as we know it are the use of linking elements. So specifically, connecting one page from the next is really what makes the World Wide Web what we know it is as today. And this tag, the href tag, is basically a tool or HTML link that can connect one page from the other. And here's your basic syntax. And then one thing that you guys will work with as you're creating multiple pages for your presentations or your projects, you'll have a combination of either absolute links, which is basically if you're referring to a page outside of your normal presentation, you're probably going to have a URL that will point using the HTTP protocol. Or if it's a relative link, link within your nested group of pages, you can use relative indexing. And again, we'll talk about this concept more as you guys start further developing your projects. So real quick checkpoint, and then we'll kind of, if you guys have computers, we're going to do a little bit of rough coding. So I just talked about absolute links and relative. Absolute, can someone give me their understanding of what an absolute link is? Yes.
It's a link to something that's not contained inside your own website.
Yep, real simply. So you have to have like a fully qualified URL or domain name to point to that. And again, relative, just the opposite of that. So if it's within your nested pages, nested group of pages that you're creating locally, in most cases on a web server or either locally, you don't have to have a fully qualified or full file path, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's if you guys have your computers, I have some code snippets I want to let you take a look at. I'll give you a chance to get logged in, and all of those things I've talked about, I've kind of put together a few code snippets. Have any of you guys heard of codepin before? Okay, so this tool, it's a tool where you can actually do coding online and share coding snippets. And I've taken the liberty of creating a few pins that I've shared with you guys. And if this is a new concept for you, you can actually go out and grab some of these code snippets to help start your template documents. Okay, so you guys, a couple of things about codepin. You'll notice when you get here, you can actually create an account. You don't have to necessarily do it right now, but the code snippets I've created, if you create your account, you can actually log in, fork my code, which basically means copy it. So if you're looking to experiment with just some basic markup and you don't have development tools at your disposal, this is a cool way that you can actually code in a browser, save it, and come back to it and be able to reuse this code if you needed to. So my hope and intent with this was, if this is brand new to you guys, at least to give you some starter documents to help get you going. And then I'm going to again follow up with some learning resources that you can actually use to further dive deeper and start creating some sample pages. So again, once you've gotten here, I have a whole bunch of boilerplate or template documents. So everything I was showing you in the sample, you can actually, this particular one I clicked on was, so once I'm there, once you're at my page, you'll notice I have a whole bunch of pins available. And the first one I'm at is the HTML5 boilerplate. And again, what you'll notice in this presentation is that you have 3 tabs, an HTML tab, and this simply represents if you were using a code editor. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So like when you're creating web pages, you really don't need a fancy tool to code HTML or any programming language. A text editor will do a lot depending if it supports the supporting language. And I'll show you guys a couple of options of what you can use when you're coding your pages. But again, this is if you're just getting started and you're trying to get ramped up on where do I go with HTML, I think this is a really cool tool that you can test it, see the output right in your browser window, and you don't have to have a really sophisticated development environment. We'll get into the CSS in a moment, and if we were doing some JavaScript, again, it's an interface that allows you to have all 3 platforms available for you, or all 3 development environments, and it shows the output in the bottom window. So we'll assume this is my browser window right below, and then you would simply type this document as if you were really coding web pages, and then it gives you real-time output. So whatever I type within the body is going to reside here as if this was the browser window. So for example, if you reflect back on the slides I gave you, you'll see the anatomy of this page. Again, that doc type definition, the HTML opening tags, and then again you have a header section. One thing I didn't talk about is best practice when you're coding is to create comments to kind of leave a breadcrumb trail. Let's say you're sharing code, and in this case you're going to be working with team members, and let's say I'm assuming you guys are going to do a divide and conquer approach with your projects. So one student may be working on one section of your project. If you notice the syntax here in HTML, a less than symbol with an exclamation point and 2 dashes, enclosed by a dash and greater than symbol, anything within that section of code will not show up in a browser window as considered an HTML comment. So if you're trying to create like a set of instructions for a team member that's working with you, you can include, in this case I use it as a signature block for my pages. So if someone were looking at this, I can leave some coding notes. This is what I was trying to do. Definitely best practice when you're coding HTML. And then again, if you look further down the page, so the anatomy of the page really starts here with the body tag. So anything within the body tag, you'll notice again the comments are not showing because they're unavailable to the browser, but I'm using in this case hello world, and if I wanted to expand upon that, I could type some more code or just type the word test. It actually shows up real time as if this was a live browser page. If I wanted to, one of the things I didn't show you, there's a whole bunch of tags, and I'll give you some resources, but let's say I wanted that word test to fall on a separate line. I could use a HTML tag called break, and it actually puts a line break in the code of that paragraph and puts it on a second line. So it's a really cool tool if you're just getting started, or even if you're doing really sophisticated web pages. You know, if you need a test environment, again, you're just trying to code something on the fly real quick, codepin's a really cool tool. It has another cool benefit is that by default, the projects that you create are open to the public. So if there's something you're trying to learn and you really don't know how to do it, you can go out and browse other people's public codepins, and you might find a snippet of code if you search for something you're trying to create. It's public domain, and you know, if people have shared their projects, it gives you a good starting point for maybe a concept you guys are trying to develop. So, any questions on that? And again, the way this works is if assuming you guys create your account, if you're able to navigate to my pin and you have your account created, if you simply hit the fork button, once you're logged in, this fork would basically copy my pin to your account, and then you can take it as a starting point and either grab the code, share it, send it through email, etc. But it's a good way to simply, you know, if you guys were just really experimenting, you could do a Control-A, copy the code, put it into a text editor, and start it as a starting point for your documents. Okay, questions? Okay. So I'm going to jump back, shift gears for a moment. So I mentioned, you know, when we get to the point where we're really ready to start developing our pages, I'm just curious, some of you guys that have done coding before, what are some of your tools of choice for development? Notepad++, which is one you'll see I have here. Any other tools that people use? Atom? Okay. I kind of picked two based upon platform. One that we use at Metro for most of our classes is Notepad++. It's a simple code editor. The cool thing about it is you can code HTML, CSS, JavaScript, a wide variety of other languages too. And I'll show you what it looks like here in just a moment. But again, to create HTML, what we're focusing on here, simple text editor. If you save your files with the proper file extension, it will, let me just kind of show you real quick. So for example, I think I have it. Let me see. Let's see. Okay. So I don't have Notepad++ installed, but I'll install it here momentarily. But this is just a Notepad simple text editor. If I were to go back to my code pin, so this block of code that I just typed, I've done a Control-A. I'm going to copy this onto the clipboard, and then even in a simple text editor like Notepad, if I were simply to paste that block of text in a Notepad editor, and I'm just going to simply save this document, and I'm going to call it index, and I'm just going to save it on my desktop. Actually, so on the break, I'll download Notepad++ to show the experience. But what I'm doing here, I just created a simple file, the one I just showed you guys, using a simple editor. Made sure I changed the file extension to .html. And if I save this, okay, so let me save it somewhere else. Okay, so once the document's saved, I really don't see anything here, but if I jump to my File Explorer, and so that document I just saved, if I double click it, it's going to open a web browser, and you should see the same content that I just typed without any formatting, but it's literally that simple. A simple text editor, correct file extension, And if you have a browser on your machine, double-clicking that file should open it up and let you display the web page. Okay, questions, you guys, on that? And again, jumping back to the presentation, again, the browsers or the editors I recommend are Notepad++, if you guys have a Mac. Anyone a Mac user here? Okay, so if you do, Visual Studio Code's another really good free cross-platform editor. Works both in Windows and Macs. And additionally, I think the other things you want to have at minimum, Google Chrome or Firefox will be my recommendations for HTML web testing. Want to take a break, G, or keep going? Or? Okay. You guys want to eat, and you want to work and eat, or you want me to finish up? I've only got about maybe 10 more minutes, or? Okay, all right. Did I lose anybody at this point? You guys still with me? Okay. Okay, so I need to speak up. All right. So assuming we've done that, you guys have started going through some iterations of code, and you want to make sure what you're doing is correct. I mentioned to you guys this tool called W3C Validator. So one of the things I would strongly recommend, and when it comes to at the end of this project, we're going to look at your code. One of the things we're going to evaluate on is how good your code is and how compliant it is based upon W3C standards. So if you have a browser window open, if you wanted to type in this web address, validator.w3.org, what this will do for you, let me open up a tab. So when you get to this website, hold on a minute. Okay. So when you get to validator.w3.org, you get a couple of options. So you have the option, if you have a page that's on a live web server, you can actually type in the URL here. And what this does, it's actually going to open up the page, go through every line of your code, and based upon W3 standards, it's going to check to see if you've coded your page that meets coding to meet the W3C compliancy standards. So for what we're doing now, I have a couple of options. I can either upload the file, point this validator to a specific URL, or since I have that code snippet copied on my clipboard, I'm going to paste it in here. And this is what we were just working with. And assuming I typed it correctly, if I hit the check button, what I'm looking for is either a red flag or a green flag. So green flag obviously tells me that everything I've typed should meet W3C standards, and there's no noticeable obvious coding errors. So you get a report at the bottom. It basically runs through every line of code. It renders your page here. It tells you if there was an error, it would actually, so for example, if I were to simply, if I forgot to type a closing brace on this element, and if I were to recheck this again, you notice the difference in output. So it tells me that there's an error on the page. The one drawback with this tool is that it's rather cryptic. It doesn't say specifically on line 3, you forgot to put this closing brace. But if you guys do use this, what I would recommend, it gives you usually a point of error. So if there's a line reference, hopefully through logical deduction, you can look from a couple lines before, a couple lines after what you're looking at. And with some practice, you can kind of determine that it does give you a little bit of hint. It highlights what should be there, but it doesn't really come out and tell you what's missing. A lot of the times you can create web pages and have syntax errors, and the pages will look fine on the front end. But again, we want to create compliant pages. So missing a few elements can add up over time and really cause fundamental issues with your pages. So we really want to stress that as you're going through your development process and iterations, that start out with good pages in the beginning. It should yield good HTML documents in the end. Okay, questions, you guys? Anything? So new information a little bit, something you guys haven't heard before? Okay, cool. All right, so let me speed this up. So bringing this all together, so I've showed you, just a real crash course in HTML, some basics. The element that actually allows our pages to have styling and aesthetic appeal is CSS, so cascading style sheets. Some of you guys have heard of this, I'm assuming. Okay, so style sheets originated from like the print world. So back before we had the web, print shops, publication offices use style guides to help dictate what like print media should look like when it's laid out. And the same concept carries over to the web. If you get a chance, you don't have to do it right now, but this is a really cool site. It just kind of shows you CSS Zen Garden. Through the power of CSS, if you have a static web page that's unformatted with some really powerful CSS, you can do really cool things taking the same code base and adding different style elements. So I would encourage you to take a look at that site when you get time. So we're going to show you real quick with the time remaining what are some basic things we can do. Again, you're not going to get all of this and you won't have it mastered before day's end, but our hope is just to kind of lay some foundation for you guys. You know, if you've done this or not really gone to this depth with your web design, hopefully this is going to be the basis for your project. So just to kind of define what works or what happens with CSS, so we know we have our HTML document. Think of your CSS as a control guide for your styling. So the beauty about having CSS is that it comes in multiple different formats. We'll talk about that here in a moment. You can have CSS either embedded in your respective HTML pages, which is called embedded styling or inline. We're going to focus our attention on external CSS files because we want to be able to have a control file that not only controls one sheet, but that controls multiple pages. So you guys are going to have what sounds like some pretty sophisticated projects. To make your lives easier, you want to have the same look and feel across your website. So if you have one file that can control all the styles on your pages, that's kind of what CSS will do for you. So if you decided for whatever reason, once you get your project created, you have a color scheme and font selections and you want to change it, instead of having to go through every single line of code on every page, if you can make that change in one file, that would make your lives or will make your lives so much easier. So we'll kind of show you what that looks like real quick. Again, I talked about the anatomy of CSS. You got 4 basic options that you can use from. Again, inline is styles that are nested inside the lines of HTML code. Embedded control the styles at the page level. External can control styles at the page level and site level. So we're going to focus our attention on external styles, one control file that controls multiple pages. Again, I'll let you guys go back and review this at your own time. Again, we're going to focus our attention on creating external style sheets. And basically, you saw how we created an HTML file. An external CSS file is simply a text file with just a .css extension. And with the use of a link element in our HTML document, we can link to an external control file that will control all of the styles within our page. CSS syntax is a little bit different than what we see with HTML. So for instance, you heard me talk about control elements or structured elements in HTML. So the body tag, for example, we use that's common in every HTML document. With CSS, if we decided we wanted to control the color, specifically this is the foreground color within a document, so whatever the font is going to look like, with the CSS control command, we can tell this CSS document that for every body tag that we want to change the foreground color to blue within our documents. So you have a basic anatomy, a selector, you tell which rule that we want to impact, what's the property that we want to control, and what value that we want it to have. So this is the basic syntax for most CSS rules. Again, here's an example. This slide just really talks about the use of, it leads into the appearance of hexadecimal color values. So browsers at this point are pretty cool. You can use real world values for color. To be most compliant, though, we want to start moving our direction towards hex value colors. Long lecture, but real simple. I'm giving you guys I believe, so right here, I've got a link. There's a website that you can actually grab some hex color codes. If you don't know what those are, most people don't remember those. As you're starting to create your pages, if you add these to your color codes, it actually gives you a broad palette of colors that you can incorporate in your pages. And then again, I'm going back a couple slides. This is just a sampling, a small sampling of some of the common CSS control elements that we can design on our page. So I'm going to speed up here. So real quick, you guys give me a couple reasons why we want to use CSS when we start creating our web pages. Somebody else. Ladies. Any idea? Grace. since you looked at me.
Make it pretty.
Yep, to make it pretty. But yep, that's a good reason. Yep. What's from a control perspective? What's the reason why we might want to use CSS? Okay. So I would say broader control and format of our pages is one of the main reasons. Okay. Anybody have any other reasons that come to mind? Yes.
Make navigation easier for the user.
With CSS?
Like just the design language.
Yes, you can control it better. Again, if we're thinking of a site as opposed to a page, the control factor that CSS offers can definitely help ease that process. So, yep. Let's see. Okay, so we'll move on. We'll come back, just for sake of time, we'll come back to these items. These next few slides, again, just give you some examples of some of the more commonly used CSS rules. So font weight, style, size are pretty self-explanatory. You can control these elements. You create a CSS rule, and then I've got some code samples we'll see here in just a moment. I would say this next section is probably one of the most important, I think, has, for me, typically proven somewhat challenging for our students, but when we want to get to a semi-intermediate level with CSS design, we're really going to focus our attention on what are called classes and IDs. And again, a whole deeper level concept. I'm going to give you guys some resources. We can't really go that deep today with time, but I think I've got some good resources that you guys can go back on your own time, dive deeper, and really practice these concepts, but at a high level. So here's what it would look like if we, let's say, have a block level element. And again, block elements, for example, would be, let's say you guys remember the H tag, the H1 selectors, the heading tags on our web page. Let's say we wanted to apply a specific style for all H1 selectors. Typically, any element that can appear more than once on a web page, which H selectors can, we typically want to use a class selector. So we're basically applying in our CSS, the notation is the dot, and it's a user-defined variable or a name that you design or define as an end user. So for whatever reason, this sample, we chose the word new, and the notation of a dot indicates that we're going to create this rule. Whenever we reference this rule or apply it to a block level element, the supporting rules will apply to this style. So for example, I should have said paragraph in this example. This paragraph, you'll notice the notation, the paragraph tag, we call the rule by class, and the rule name is, in this case, new. So in quotations, whenever this rule is encountered, it's going to go out to the CSS page, look at these styling elements, and this is the result that we'll get. So an italic font red page, or italic page with fit red font. Can't even talk today. So that's one example of a class rule. And in comparison, an ID rule, basically they're the same, but the main difference is that with IDs, ideally and normally, we only use these with one occurrence within a page. So if we think about block level elements, if you guys can reflect back, I showed you a page that had header, a main section, and a footer. In most pages, you can only have like a header one time and a footer one time. So let's say if you have a footer that you only can have, you're typically only going to have one occurrence of a footer in a page, an ID rule might be appropriate for that case. So same concept, the syntax looks basically the same, but understanding that concept of when you apply IDs and classes can be somewhat tricky. Again, we can talk about this later, but just wanted to give you a basic understanding. The main difference is the notation. Rule name is the same, hashtag for IDs, period for classes, but everything else is pretty much the same. Okay? So, real quick, I know food is here, we're going to move on. Let's see. Just a couple of key takeaways. Again, when we're creating these control files, a text file with the .css extension is the main thing you want to keep in mind. Again, CSS files, the main importance of these is creating the cascade. So here's a small snippet of CSS code. In this case, we're controlling a body rule, H2, and a navigation. You see some sample notations, and again, one control document can control these elements in all these subsequent pages. So I've got some snippets here, and I'm just going to speed up real quick. I think the one key element that you really want to walk away with is to tie this all together in your HTML document, whatever you define that CSS document to be, that external file, this line of code and the variable, whatever the file name is that's going to reside within your HTML document. So if you can remember this line, this is slide number 51 if you're making notes. This is really what ties it all together, external files and HTML documents. Again, just another code snippet. And so I think we'll move through this. Again, real quick, browser looks at style sheets, and I just kind of give you the order of precedence on when style sheets are referenced. I haven't spent too much time on these, so again, you guys can double back on your own time and look at this and kind of dive a little bit deeper. The last closing point, just like with our HTML, there are style rules and syntax syntax rules that we want to follow with our CSS. So there's also a CSS validator that you guys I would strongly recommend using when you're coding your pages. Same process, you can copy your code, paste it into the input area, and it'll give you a report if your code is valid or not. Okay, I think that's all I have. So I would say for me, for you guys, the most important piece of what I'm hoping giving you guys today is that you have some follow-on resources. W3 Schools, as I think, is a really great tool if you've never used CSS before or HTML. They've got some tutorials or primers that can take you from ground zero to really intermediate to advanced coding. So again, if this is new for you guys, strongly recommend check this out. Another good one that's more interactive is Code Academy. Has anybody ever used this site before? Okay, cool. Lynda.com, if you guys have a Omaha Public Library account, Lynda.com is another, I think, even better than Code Academy. There's tutorials on a wide variety of technology topics. If you go to any public library, get a library card. You can actually get a library card online. It gives you unlimited free access to all of the Lynda.com tutorials. And then finally, W3C is just kind of your resource tool to help validate everything you've learned from these sites. So in summary, if you guys are getting started, I know some of you guys have some experience with this, great. You know, if you're looking to kind of expand that, you've got these sites that can kind of help you go one step further. And those of you that are just getting started, in my opinion, I think in this order of precedence, check those out. They're going to really help you guys get going if you need some help. Questions, you guys? All right, so let's eat. Everybody ready to eat? All right, thank you guys.